At the end of World War II, the British and American leaders knew that the Soviet Union was now the greatest threat to their safety. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee proposed in August 1945 that the UK develop its own atomic bomb as an independent nuclear, one of the RAF's V-bombers, the aircraft that made up the United Kingdom's strategic nuclear strike force. The bombers were the Vickers Valiant, the Handley Page Victor, and the Avro Vulcan. The Vickers Valiant was the first in 1955. Valiants were the most active of the three V-bombers, seeing action in the Suez Crisis of 1956, and a Valiant dropped Britain's first ever hydrogen bomb. These operations alone ensured the Valiant a place in history.
Now the Victor, Britain's crescent-wing bomber. Powered by 4 Sapphire jet engines, it's already in super priority production for the RAF. Few details have been released about the Victor, but there seems little doubt it's intended as Britain's #1 atom bomber.
The famous Dambuster squadron is being reformed to fly Vulcans. Meanwhile, the air crews are... With a greater hitting power than all the 7,000 last war Lancasters combined, the Vulcan is the worthy spearhead of Britain's V-bomber force.
How do you think you'll do?
I wouldn't like to prophesy. We've only got 2 teams going over, the Vulcan and the Valiant team. There's a very large number of Strategic Air Command teams against us, all of the highest class. What I think we can say is we won't displace ourselves, but for the rest, the odds of numbers against us, we'll do our best.
Thank you.
Not a bit. I think it did extremely well. One has to remember that the contest, the competition was not to test or evaluate the relative performance of the aircraft, but rather to test the skill of the crews, both ground and air crew, in the use of their equipment. And in that we produced very good scores. We didn't abort any of the missions. Our navigation was accurate enough to get us to the targets, and the actual errors in bombing were much smaller than were necessary to give a good account of ourselves in an operational mission with a nuclear weapon.
What did the American Air Force think of your bombers, especially the Vulcan?
They were terribly interested in it. Wherever we went, on these SAC bases, we went to many of them.
That's the Strategic Air Command?
Yes, Strategic Air Command. They crowded round, crawled all over it, and openly expressed their admiration of its shape and its performance. And
a non-stop flight from England to Australia.
Coming into land at Richmond near Sydney as calmly as on a routine flight, Squadron Leader Beavis completed the 11,500-mile non-stop flight from Scampton, Lincolnshire. The RAF Vulcan had flown halfway around the world in 20 hours, 3 minutes, refueling 3 times in the air.
The Vulcan, piloted by Squadron Leader Michael Beavis, was refueled over Cyprus, Karachi, and finally Singapore. Record-breaking flights were great for publicity and enhanced reputations, but they did actually have a real strategic purpose. They were ideal for long-range deployment practice in times of war, and of course, just such a deployment would be required for the Vulcans kept on standby 24 hours a day, waiting for the call to arms. As you would expect, it provided...
If anything, it shows that we by no means lost our interest in our many friends in Europe. We are loyal members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and indeed this is a very great contribution to their strength.
But can it be said that by handing over the V-bomber force, we've given away the last shreds of our nuclear independence?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. You don't weaken yourself by working with your friends and allies. Just the same as we've been working in with the Strategic Air Command in America, hasn't weakened our independent power to use these bombers if ever, as I hope not, we should be left alone. No, this strengthens us. It doesn't weaken us and doesn't weaken our independence.
Despite Watkinson's conviction that Britain's independent nuclear capability remains strong, in reality, the US Skybelt project, on which Britain had pinned its hopes, was already US developed. The final part of the jigsaw was the early warning system that would alert the bombers to scramble. They were nicknamed the Golf Bulls. Valiants, 39 Victors, and 70 Vulcans in service. At the heart of Bomber Command were 9 Vulcan squadrons, which could operate from 10 designated airfields around the country, mainly based in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia. Typical of these airfields was RAF Waddington, situated just a few miles south of Lincoln. This film from the ITN archives was originally made to celebrate Waddington receiving the freedom of the city of Lincoln. Waddington was not the only Lincolnshire. 1969, responsibility for...
It was much earlier, a much earlier airplane. And Victor just, I mean, anybody who looks at the Victor couldn't possibly think it would ever work, you know, it's the funny, that odd shape and things like that. But this is just the best, this is, you know, we always considered it was the best airplane.
When you're standing on the ground next to her, she looks like a very big aircraft, but up here in the cockpit, surrounded by dials and this particular pulley, which would shoot me out of the roof if I pulled it, it's not quite so big. In fact, it's about the size of a telephone box. Vulcan meant the god of weaponry, and it was a very apt title for an aircraft which was once Britain's nuclear deterrent. But now, 25 years later, she's about as obsolete as the dinosaur.
It's a great airplane. Well, it was in its time. Of course, it's old-fashioned now. You know, a lot of the equipment that you can see here is old-fashioned. But it still works very well because they still win competitions with it. They still beat the Americans, who have, you know, the best kit in the world.
From today, this bomber becomes a museum piece, just like the Spitfire and the Lancaster before her. The Tornado is smaller, more manoeuvrable, faster, and packs a bigger punch. But I wonder if she'll look quite as good in flight as this old Vulcan.
By the spring of 1982, just 3 squadrons remained, weeks away from being disbanded. And then Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, far away in the South Atlantic. The Vulcans, practically on their way to the scrapyard, were given a last-minute reprieve. The Vulcans were tasked with the bombing of Port Stanley Airport, the only runway on the islands. With the airport being used to supply Argentine troops, and fearing Argentina would use the airstrip to attack British fighters, the British government made it a priority target. The task ahead was mammoth. 5 Vulcans had to be modified. Their refueling probes had not been used for years, and many had to be replaced. New navigation and radar jammers were fitted. And of course, the Vulcan crews trained intensively for the night bombing and refueling tasks ahead. On the 29th of April 1982, the Vulcans took off for the long trip to Wide Awake Airfield on Ascension Island, their base for the operation, now codenamed Black Buck. Accompanying them were the Victor tankers, so vital to the successful outcome of the operation. 24 hours later, Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers took off in Vulcan B-2 XM607 on the first mission. The operation involved 1 backup Vulcan and 11 Victor tankers. The mission took almost 16 hours, covering a total distance of 7,500 miles. At the time, it was the longest bombing mission in history. 21 1,000-pound bombs were dropped, one of them hitting the runway as per the original plan.
Well, we flew from Ascension Island, and then it was a 15 3/4 hour flight, which involved air-to-air refueling all the way. We refueled a total of 7 times to get there, and our main achievement was that we did hit the runway with 1 out of our 21 bombs, but it parked it right in the middle of the runway about 1/3 of the way down, and thereafter no Argentinian fighter aircraft operated off that runway.
We actually dropped from 10,000 feet rather than the 8.
And was it a successful mission?
Oh yes, yeah, the first one was dropping bombs, although when you think we dropped 21,000 pounders, only 1 hit the runway. And the reason for that is because if you try to hit with them all, if you fly along the line of the runway, if one misses, they all miss.
There were 7 Black Buck missions in all, the later ones using either Shrike anti-radar missiles or airburst bombs against Argentinian troops. One mission, Black Buck 6, flown by Flight Lieutenant Neil McDougall, suffered a broken refueling probe and was forced to land in Brazil. The aircraft was impounded for a few days and then, minus its Shrike missile, allowed to take off for ascension.
I was captain of the crew that did the Shrike missile attacks down at the Falklands, and eventually finished up on the second sortie by diverting into Rio and spent a week in Rio before coming back to UK.
What actually happened there?
Oh, the nose probe. Normally on the aircraft, just above the TFR pod, there is a nose probe through which we can receive fuel from a tanker. And unfortunately, on that particular occasion, the probe broke when we were in contact with the tanker, so we couldn't get any fuel.
What were your feelings at the time?
My feelings at the time were not surprised, because it had not happened to me for some time, but it happens on a fairly regular basis. It is a weak point. It's a designed weak point in the system, so that we don't do any more damage to the aircraft. And I can't say I was particularly surprised, and it was just a case of get on and do the job that you're paid to do.
The enormous distances of the attacks and the sheer shock value of unexpected major bombing attacks undoubtedly discouraged the already doubtful Argentinian troops. Blackbuck ensured that the Vulcan found its place in history. After the Falklands War, some Vulcans were given a short-term reprieve, but slowly retired squadron by squadron over the next few years.
At Waddington in Lincolnshire today, the RAF showed how things used to be by scrambling 4 Vulcans into the air. First in service 22 years ago, the Vulcan was designed
in 1962 on 35 Squadron down at Coningsby. This one has been a free-fall bomber, it's been a nuclear bomber, it's been a blue steel bomber, and it's even been part of the workup for the corporates. So it's seen full life in the Air Force, and it's tired. It's tired and it's time to put to bed.
Lot number 9, the Avro Vulcan has to strike. Lot number 9. I am bid £2,000.
Another Vulcan, XL426, was sold to Roy Jacobson, and to this day is preserved at Southend Airport in taxiing condition and maintained by the Vulcan Restoration Trust. And yet another is sold to a company with mysterious plans.
We want to incorporate it in the building to make something exciting and novel, and something that's going to strike people as absolutely stunning. It'll be something, the plans are under wraps at the moment, but it'll be something completely unique.
But what everyone wants to see is a Vulcan flying, one of the most majestic and powerful sights in the sky. For more than 10 years, the RAF maintained a Vulcan display team. XH-558 became possibly the most sought-after and eagerly awaited airshow performer in Britain. But on the 20th of September 1992, the Vulcan gave her last performance at Cranfield Airshow. Starting her display, flanked by the Red Arrows in a V-shaped formation, XH-558 delighted her many admirers gathered to watch the Vulcan's final flight as an RAF display aircraft.
Wiring safe or the system safe?
It's very important that we have the money, because we're halfway through now, really, the restoration, which is amazing, and it's going so extremely well. But it